The frontier town of Blackstone Ridge was built between towering gray mountains, where the wind howled through narrow valleys and miners spent their lives searching for silver beneath the earth. It was a hard place where people respected strength, but they were often cruel to anyone who seemed different. Among the townspeople lived an orc girl named Alara, a tall, strong woman with green skin, long dark hair, and striking golden eyes. She had the strength to carry heavy sacks of ore and the courage to face dangers that would make most men run. Yet, despite everything she could do, the people of Blackstone Ridge saw only one thing when they looked at her. She was an orc. Alara had spent most of her life being treated as someone who didn't belong. Human women whispered whenever she entered the general store, while children sometimes followed her through the streets, laughing and calling her cruel names. She had learned to ignore them. What hurt more were the men who pretended to admire her strength but disappeared whenever the possibility of marriage was mentioned. Over the years, 7 different men had approached Alara. Each one had initially claimed that he admired her courage and independence. But when the time came to make a serious commitment, every man found an excuse to leave. One said she was too strong. Another said humans and orcs could never live together. A third admitted that he was embarrassed to be seen with her. The others simply stopped visiting her without explanation. Alara remembered every rejection. She never begged any of them to stay. Instead, she built a small home near the edge of town and worked for herself. She carried supplies for miners, repaired broken fences, hunted in the surrounding hills, and helped elderly neighbors who couldn't manage difficult work. She rarely asked anyone for help. One cold evening, Alara entered the town's crowded saloon to deliver a shipment of supplies. The moment she walked inside, several men turned toward her. She immediately recognized some of them. The 7 men who had rejected her. Their laughter filled the room. One of them raised his cup and jokingly announced that perhaps Alara had finally come looking for another husband. The others laughed loudly. Even strangers joined in, amused by her humiliation. Alara stood perfectly still. For a moment, anger burned inside her. She could have easily thrown the man across the room. She was stronger than almost everyone there. But she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. Instead, she quietly placed the supplies on the counter and walked toward the door. Then someone new entered the saloon. He was a rugged human mountain miner named Caleb, carrying a worn leather pack and covered in dust from the mountain trails. He was a stranger to Blackstone Ridge, and unlike everyone else, he didn't laugh. Caleb watched Alara walk away. He didn't see an unwanted orc girl. He saw a woman who had endured humiliation without surrendering her dignity. And for the first time in years, someone in Blackstone Ridge looked at Alara with something she had almost forgotten existed. Respect. The next morning, Blackstone Ridge woke beneath a pale gray sky. The storm clouds that had gathered over the mountains had disappeared, but a cold wind still swept through the narrow streets. Miners hurried toward the mountain trails, shopkeepers opened their doors, and wagons loaded with supplies rattled across the muddy road. Alara was already working. She stood behind the town's supply store, lifting heavy sacks of flour and grain from a wagon. The sacks were too heavy for most people to carry alone, but Alara moved them without complaint. Her muscular arms made the work look easy, though her back ached from years of labor. She had learned long ago that if she wanted something done, she had to do it herself. While Alara worked, she noticed a stranger standing near the road. It was the same man who had entered the saloon the night before. The human miner. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in worn mountain clothes covered with dust. A dark beard framed his serious face, and his brown eyes quietly studied the town around him. A pickaxe rested against his shoulder, and an old leather bag hung at his side. His name was Caleb. He had come to Blackstone Ridge searching for silver. Unlike the other miners, Caleb had no family waiting for him and no friends in town. He preferred the mountains because they were honest. A mountain never pretended to be your friend before turning its back on you. As Alara lifted another sack, Caleb noticed that one of the wooden wheels beneath the wagon had cracked. Before she could reach for it, Caleb stepped forward. "That wheel won't survive another trip," he said. Elara looked at him suspiciously. "I know." Caleb glanced at the wagon. "Then why are you still loading it?" "Because the supplies need to reach the store." Caleb stared at her for a moment. Then, without another word, he placed his pickaxe against the wall and began repairing the wheel. Elara frowned. "I didn't ask you to help." "I know." "Then why are you doing it?" Caleb tightened a wooden brace around the broken wheel. "Because it needs fixing." That simple answer surprised her. Most men who approached Elara wanted something in return. They wanted her labor, her strength, or the admiration that came from being associated with someone powerful. Caleb seemed to expect nothing. When the wheel was repaired, he stood and wiped the dirt from his hands. "There," he said. Elara examined the repair. It was strong. "You know what you're doing," she admitted. Caleb smiled faintly. "I've spent most of my life fixing things that were trying to break." Elara almost smiled at the strange answer. Almost. Then a sudden cry came from the far end of the street. A group of children had been playing near the edge of town when a frightened horse broke free from a wagon. The animal charged wildly toward them. Everyone froze. Elara reacted instantly. She dropped the sack in her hands and ran. The horse thundered toward the children. Elara stepped directly into its path. With incredible strength, she grabbed the reins and pulled hard. The horse reared, but Elara refused to let go. She spoke softly until the frightened animal finally calmed. The children were safe. The townspeople stared. Caleb watched silently. He had seen many brave miners in his life, but few people possessed the courage Elara had shown. When she returned, expecting the usual whispers, Caleb simply looked at her. "That was brave." Elara shrugged. "They were children. You could have been hurt." "So could they." Caleb nodded. For the first time, Elara noticed something different in his eyes. There was no fear. No disgust. No embarrassment. Only respect. And that frightened her more than hatred ever had. Because deep inside, beneath all the walls she had built around her heart, Elara wondered whether this strange mountain miner might actually be different from the 7 men who had come before him. For the next several days, Caleb remained in Blackstone Ridge, preparing for his journey into the mountains. He rented a small room above the town's general store and spent his mornings purchasing supplies, repairing his equipment, and studying the old mining maps he had brought with him. Elara tried not to pay attention to him. But Caleb seemed to appear everywhere. Sometimes she saw him walking toward the mountain trail with his pickaxe over his shoulder. Other times, he was sitting quietly outside the general store, drinking coffee and watching the world pass by. He never followed her or demanded her attention. He never asked personal questions. That was what made him so difficult to understand. The 7 men who had rejected Elara had always wanted to know what she could do for them. Caleb seemed interested in who she was. One afternoon, Elara entered the town saloon to deliver a package. The moment she stepped inside, the room became unusually quiet. She immediately recognized the faces around the tables. Several of the 7 men were there. The same men who had laughed at her days earlier. Elara turned toward the counter, hoping to finish her business without trouble. But then one of the men, Garrick, called out loudly. "Look who's back." Elara stopped. Garrick leaned against his chair with a crooked smile. "I thought you were done searching for a husband." Laughter erupted around the room. Elara's jaw tightened. Another man lifted his cup. Maybe she finally realized nobody wants an orc wife. More laughter. Elara slowly turned around. She had heard enough. "You rejected me," she said calmly. "That doesn't mean nobody wants me." The room fell silent for a moment. Garrick laughed. 7 men rejected you, Elara. How many more do you need before you understand? The word struck deeper than she wanted to admit. She had spent years pretending that the rejection didn't matter. But standing there in front of everyone, Elara suddenly felt the weight of every abandoned promise and every cruel excuse. Then the saloon doors opened. Caleb walked inside. Dust covered his coat, and his boots were muddy from the mountain trail. He stopped when he saw Elara standing in the center of the room. Then he heard Garrick's final words. Caleb's expression hardened. He walked forward. Garrick looked at him. And who are you? Caleb ignored the question. His eyes remained on Elara. You heading home? Elara blinked. Why? Because I was hoping you'd come with me. The entire saloon went silent. Elara stared at him. Garrick burst out laughing. You? Caleb finally looked at him. Yes. Me. Garrick shook his head. You don't know anything about her. Caleb's voice remained calm. I know she works harder than most men in this town. He took another step forward. I know she protects people who can't protect themselves. Then he looked directly at Elara. And I know she has more courage than anyone sitting in this room. Nobody laughed now. Caleb turned toward the 7 men. You had your chance to choose her. His voice became firm. You chose not to. Then he looked back at Elara. I'm choosing her. Elara's heart seemed to stop. For years, she had dreamed of hearing someone say those words. But now that they had finally come, she didn't know how to accept them. She shook her head. You don't know me. Caleb nodded. Not yet. The simple answer stunned her. He wasn't pretending to know everything about her. He wasn't making promises he couldn't keep. He was simply saying that he wanted the chance to learn. Elara looked around the room. The 7 men who had rejected her were silent. For once, they had nothing cruel to say. Caleb extended his hand. Come with me, Elara. She stared at his hand. Every instinct told her to walk away. Every wound from the past warned her not to trust another man. But something inside her had changed. Slowly, Elara placed her hand in Caleb's. The saloon erupted into whispers. The unwanted orc girl had finally been chosen. But Elara knew something the others didn't. Caleb hadn't chosen her because she was beautiful, powerful, or useful. He had chosen her because he had seen the woman beneath everything the world had judged. And for the first time in her life, Elara wondered if perhaps she had finally found someone worth choosing in return. The morning after Caleb publicly chose Elara, the entire town seemed to have something to say. Some people laughed. Others whispered. A few even claimed that Caleb had lost his mind. Elara heard all of it. She had spent her entire life being judged by people who knew nothing about her, so she refused to let their words change her. Still, Caleb's declaration continued to trouble her. He had said he was choosing her. But Elara had learned that words were easy. Promises were easy. It was actions that mattered. 3 days later, Caleb prepared to leave for the mountains. He had discovered an old mining map that suggested a rich silver vein existed inside an abandoned mine high above Blackstone Ridge. The journey was dangerous. Most miners refused to go there because the mountain trails were narrow and unstable. But Caleb had spent years exploring dangerous places, and he believed the mine could change his future. Elara happened to be delivering supplies near the edge of town when she saw him preparing his horse. "You're going alone?" she asked. Caleb looked at her. "That's the plan." Elara studied the supplies packed onto his horse. "You won't make it through the northern trail with that much weight." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Is that your way of saying I need help?" "No." A faint smile appeared on his face. "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying you're going to get yourself killed." Caleb laughed quietly. Elara crossed her arms. I know those mountains better than you. Then perhaps you should come with me. She immediately regretted speaking. I didn't say I wanted to. I know. There was that answer again. For some reason, it made her smile. By midday, they were riding together toward the mountains. At first, the journey was quiet. Caleb tried to make conversation, but Alara remained cautious. She didn't want to reveal too much about herself. She had trusted people before, and every time she had opened her heart, someone had found a way to hurt her. But the mountains had a way of making silence comfortable. As the sun began to disappear behind the peaks, dark clouds gathered overhead. Alara looked toward the sky. We need to turn back. Caleb frowned. Why? Storm. He looked at the clouds. I've seen worse. Not here. Thunder echoed through the valley. A moment later, rain began pouring down. The trail quickly became dangerous. Their horses panicked as water rushed down the mountainside. There's an abandoned mine nearby. Alara shouted. They hurried toward it. But before they reached the entrance, a section of the mountain collapsed behind them. Rocks crashed onto the trail. They were trapped. Caleb dismounted and examined the blocked passage. We can't go back. Alara looked toward the mine. Then we'll have to go through. Inside, the abandoned mine was dark and freezing. Their lantern cast trembling shadows across the walls. They walked deeper into the tunnels, searching for another exit. Suddenly, the ground shook. Alara grabbed Caleb's arm. A huge section of the ceiling collapsed behind them. Dust filled the tunnel. Caleb coughed. Are you hurt? I'm fine. He looked at her carefully. Are you sure? Alara nodded. For the first time, she realized that Caleb's concern wasn't an act. He genuinely cared whether she was safe. They continued deeper into the mine. Hours passed. Their food supplies were limited, and the storm outside showed no sign of stopping. Eventually, they found a small chamber where they could rest. A fire burned between them. The silence was different now. There was nowhere to run. No town. No gossip. No 7 men reminding Alara of everything she had lost. Just her and Caleb. Why did you choose me? She finally asked. Caleb looked at the fire. Because I saw you. Alara frowned. Everyone sees me. No, he said quietly. They see your skin. Your strength. Your size. They see an orc and decide they already know you. He looked into her golden eyes. I saw you save those children. Alara lowered her gaze. That doesn't mean you know me. You're right. Caleb paused. But I want to. Those words reached a place inside her that she had tried to bury for years. Alara finally told him about the 7 men. She told him how each one had promised to stay, only to disappear when life became difficult. Caleb listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't tell her she was wrong to feel hurt. When she finished, he simply said, they were fools. Alara gave a small laugh. 7 fools. At least 7. For the first time, she laughed openly. The sound echoed through the cold mine. Caleb smiled. Then the mountain shook again. The fire flickered. Dust fell from the ceiling. Alara and Caleb looked at each other. They both understood. The mine was becoming more dangerous. If they wanted to survive, they would have to trust each other completely. And somewhere beneath the mountain, surrounded by darkness and danger, the walls between 2 wounded hearts began to disappear. The storm finally passed 3 days later. When Caleb and Alara emerged from the abandoned mine, they looked exhausted. Their clothes were covered in dust, their faces were bruised, and they had barely enough strength to lead their horses down the mountain. But they were alive. And neither of them was the same person who had entered the mine. During those 3 days underground, they had learned to trust each other completely. Caleb had discovered that Elara wasn't simply strong, she was compassionate, patient, and fiercely protective. Elara had discovered that Caleb's quiet nature hid a man who was loyal enough to risk his life for someone he loved. Neither had spoken the word love. Not yet. But something had changed between them. When they finally returned to Blackstone Ridge, the entire town gathered in the street. Everyone had believed they were dead. The mountain storm had destroyed several trails, and search parties had been unable to reach the northern mine. Elara stepped down from her horse. Her eyes immediately found the 7 men who had once rejected her. They were standing together near the saloon. And they looked different now. The moment Caleb had left town with Elara, rumors had spread. Then, when the two failed to return, people began whispering that Caleb had made a terrible mistake. But now they were back. Alive. Together. Garrick stepped forward. Elara. She stopped. What do you want? Garrick looked uncomfortable. I heard what happened. Everyone heard. He swallowed. I wanted to apologize. Elara stared at him. For what? Garrick glanced at the other men. For the way we treated you. Elara's expression remained cold. Why now? Garrick didn't answer. Another man stepped forward. You've changed. Elara almost laughed. No. You just see me differently now. The man's face reddened. Before he could respond, Garrick looked toward Caleb. You found silver, didn't you? Caleb remained silent. That silence was answer enough. News had already reached town that Caleb had discovered a rich silver vein inside the abandoned mine. Suddenly, the 7 men understood. Caleb wasn't just a poor mountain miner anymore. He had found a fortune. And the woman beside him was the same woman they had once rejected. Garrick's eyes returned to Elara. I made a mistake. You did. I didn't understand your worth. Elara shook her head. You understood it perfectly. You just didn't value it. The words silenced him. For years, Elara had imagined what she would say if the 7 men ever came back. She had thought she might cry. She had thought she might forgive them. Instead, she felt nothing. Their opinions no longer mattered. Then one of the men stepped forward. You don't have to stay with him. Elara's eyes narrowed. Excuse me. You could have a better life now. Elara looked at Caleb. He stood several steps away, giving her the freedom to make her own choice. That was when she understood the difference between him and the others. The 7 men wanted her now because Caleb had chosen her. Caleb had chosen her before anyone knew what she was worth. Elara turned back toward them. You had 7 chances. Nobody spoke. 7. Her voice grew stronger. You saw me when I was alone. You saw me when I struggled. You saw me working every day. You saw me helping people who couldn't repay me. She looked directly at Garrick. And every single one of you decided I wasn't good enough. The men lowered their eyes. Elara continued. Now you see a man standing beside me. You see a silver mine. You see a future you suddenly want. She took Caleb's hand. But I see the man who stood beside me when there was nothing to gain. Caleb looked at her. Their eyes met. Elara squeezed his hand. That's why I choose him. The crowd fell silent. This time, Elara wasn't the unwanted girl standing alone in the middle of the saloon. She was a woman who knew exactly what she deserved. Caleb stepped beside her. Together, they walked away from the 7 men. But before leaving town, Elara stopped. She looked back at the people who had spent years judging her. I was never the one who needed to be chosen. Then she turned toward Caleb. I only needed to choose the right person. Caleb smiled. And together, they began walking toward the mountain. Behind them, the 7 men remained silent. For the first time, they understood the truth. They hadn't lost Elara because Caleb had taken her away. They had lost her because they had never been brave enough to see her value. The following spring, Blackstone Ridge looked different. The harsh winter had finally ended, and the mountains were covered in fresh green grass. Snow still rested on the highest peaks, shining beneath the warm morning sun. But the biggest change wasn't in the mountains. It was in Elara. The woman everyone had once called Unwanted was no longer living on the edge of town. She had a home in the mountains. A beautiful wooden cabin stood beside a clear stream, surrounded by tall pine trees and wildflowers. It wasn't a mansion, and Elara didn't want one. She had learned that happiness wasn't measured by wealth or possessions. Her happiness came from knowing she had finally found a place where she belonged. And beside her was Caleb. Together, they had built a new life. Caleb continued working the silver mine, but he never became obsessed with wealth. He sold enough silver to improve their home and secure their future, but he continued to spend most of his days exploring the mountains. Elara worked beside him. She helped repair the mining equipment, managed their supplies, and learned everything she could about the mountains. She was no longer simply surviving. She was building something. One morning, a messenger arrived at their cabin. The man was exhausted. He had ridden all the way from Blackstone Ridge. "Elara," he called. She stepped outside. "What happened?" The messenger looked worried. "There's trouble in town." Elara immediately glanced toward Caleb. "What kind of trouble?" "A group of bandits attacked the southern road. They stole supplies and injured several people." Caleb reached for his rifle. "We'll go." Elara nodded. The journey back to Blackstone Ridge took several hours. When they arrived, the town was in chaos. Several buildings had been damaged, and many families had lost their food supplies. The townspeople immediately recognized Elara. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked afraid. But Elara didn't care about the past. She immediately began helping. She carried heavy crates into the storage building. Caleb organized the miners and helped repair the damaged structures. Together, they worked from sunrise until darkness. The 7 men who had once rejected Elara watched from a distance. They saw something they had never understood before. Elara had never needed a man to save her. She had needed someone who respected her enough to stand beside her. When the work was finished, Garrick approached her. "I was wrong about you." Elara looked at him. "I know." He lowered his head. "I wish I had realized it sooner." Elara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So do I." Garrick looked surprised. Elara continued. "Not because I wanted you. Because I wasted years believing there was something wrong with me." Her voice softened. "That's what rejection can do. It can make you question your own worth." Garrick had no answer. Elara turned away. Across the street, Caleb was waiting for her. He didn't call her. He didn't demand that she follow him. He simply waited. Elara smiled. Then she walked toward him. Caleb held out his hand. She took it. Months later, the two were married in a small ceremony near their mountain home. There was no grand celebration. No wealthy guests. No fancy clothes. Only a few friends, the people they had helped, and the sound of wind moving through the pine trees. Elara wore a simple white dress. Caleb stood beside her in his best mountain coat. When the ceremony ended, Caleb looked into her golden eyes. "I chose you once," he whispered. Elara smiled. "And I chose you too." Caleb shook his head. "No. I mean every day." Her eyes filled with tears. He gently took her hand. "Every morning, I wake up and choose you again." Elara finally understood. The 7 men had taught her what rejection felt like. But Caleb had taught her something far more important. Love wasn't about finding someone who thought you were perfect. It was about finding someone who saw your flaws, your scars, your fears, and still chose to stay. Years later, people in Blackstone Ridge still told stories about the orc girl who had been rejected by 7 men. But Alara never remembered the story that way. To her, the 7 rejections were only the beginning. Because if even one of those men had stayed, she might never have met Caleb. She might never have discovered the mountain home where she finally felt safe. She might never have learned that the right person would never ask her to become smaller, quieter, or less herself just to be loved. Caleb had chosen her. Not because she was an orc. Not because she was strong. Not because she could help him find silver. He had chosen her because he had seen her heart. And in the end, Alara realized the greatest truth of her life. Being rejected by 7 men had not made her unwanted. It had simply led her to the one man who knew exactly what she was worth, and chose her anyway.